There are more updates on this story. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova earlier made a statement in the daily press briefing. She said and expressed Russia's position on the security guarantees sought by Ukraine. She stated that the security guarantees that the Kyiv is seeking to pose a threat to the European continent. This statement comes as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is holding talks with the European leaders, with the central issue of the discussions remaining the security guarantees for Ukraine. Meanwhile, both Ukrainian and Russian forces continue to maintain active front lines amidst ongoing talks about a potential meeting between the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. Actually, in fact, listen in to what the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson had to say.
Что Россия не собирается обсуждать в корне неприемлемую и подрывающую всякую, любую безопасность иностранную интервенцию на Украине в какой бы то ни было форме, в каком бы то ни было формате. Идеи киевского главаря, которые являются, по сути, калькой инициатив европейских спонсоров, даже не спонсоров, а Европейской партии войны, как мы уже не раз говорили, носят абсолютно неприемлемый характер. Они направлены на сохранение Украины в качестве плацдарма для террора, для провокаций против нашей страны. Они являются гарантиями небезопасности Украины. Они являются гарантиями опасности европейскому.
Andrew, do explain to me, especially when President Putin was in China, in Tianjin, he was attending the SEO summit, and there were two big statements that came from him. He said that he legitimized the Russian offensive against Ukraine, pointing out, number one, the reason for Russia to strike Ukraine was, first of all, Ukraine's desire to be part of NATO, and the second of all, the coup d'etat that took place in Ukraine, in Kyiv. How justifiable are those reasons that have been given by Russia to fight Ukraine?
Well, there's a third one, too, which is his claim that the post-2014 Ukrainian regime was persecuting Russian speakers, especially in the Donbass region. So there were three kind of rationales. The Maidan Revolution back in 2014, there are various interpretations. I don't think it was a coup. I'm not sure that everybody was playing by the rules, but I don't think it qualified as a coup. But it certainly was a change of direction. The previous government had been very pro-Eurasian orientation for Ukraine, and then the subsequent government saw Ukraine as part of the West and aspired to European Union membership, but more importantly, NATO membership. Now, since the end of the Cold War, we've seen the creep of NATO eastward, including, by the way, to incorporate former members of the Soviet Union, the so-called Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And at each time this has happened, the Russians have said, thus far and no further, we're drawing a red line. And then NATO expanded, and the Russians would say, no, we really mean it this time. Do not expand anymore. And NATO would expand again. And it is, of course, the sovereign right of the countries that were joining NATO to join NATO. That's international law 101. But it didn't look that way from Moscow. So I think there's more credibility to the narrative that Putin was spinning around NATO expansion and has been spinning for a long time, rather than Russian imperialism or any the 2014 change of government in Kyiv. I think that has been a long-standing Russian gripe. It has been perhaps a source of legitimate concern on the part of the Russians, although I think it's vastly overblown. NATO is defensive, not offensive. So I wouldn't give too much objective credence to Putin's narrative, but I think it's a narrative that he actually buys into and is motivating him and the people around him to a significant degree.
Also, talking about the coalition of the willing, there's yet another meeting that has been organized, which is taking place in Paris. Do you think any substantial, tangible actionables are going to come out? Are there key outcomes that are going to come out of this meeting? Or until and unless there is Trump that is in the picture, there's nothing that the European allies can really do to stop the war or initiate a peace deal?
The European allies, of course, are divided. NATO is not going to act as NATO, but the French and the British and perhaps one or two others might issue some proclamations. But I think it's going to be at the level of rhetoric. I don't think British troops and French troops are going to deploy without at least some sort of blessing from the United States government and Donald Trump. I just don't see that happening. It has to be said, too, that the British and the French don't have much in the way of military forces that could be reassuring to anybody these days. Generations now, post-Cold War, budget cuts and reductions in their forces have left them in a less than optimal position, especially against the battle-hardened Russian army. They're there as a tripwire. If they were to be deployed, they would be there as a tripwire, which is to say, if Russia would have to think twice about continuing or violating a ceasefire because it might kill a French soldier or a British soldier, and then who knows what would happen. Would that violate Article 5 of the NATO treaty? Would that incline or initiate an escalatory spiral? And who knows where that ends? The British and the French, to remind your viewers, have nuclear weapons. Russia has nuclear weapons. And we never quite know, as the Cuban Missile Crisis taught us, and as the Berlin Crisis taught us, and as a few other incidents taught us during the Cold War, you never know where a fairly minor development can escalate into and take us to the brink of nuclear war. That's both a deterrent for Putin, because he doesn't know either how that escalation, but it's also an invitation to brinkmanship. Nobody wants to blink. Nobody wants to back down. Everybody wants to win. And who knows then when you're going to cross the red line inadvertently.